There's a weight you've been carrying, isn't there? A collection of moments that didn't go the way you planned, failures that still sting when you remember them, losses that carved something out of you that hasn't quite filled back in, betrayals that taught you who people really are when the stakes get high, rejections that made you question your worth, years that felt wasted, paths that led nowhere, choices that turned out to be mistakes, and you've been holding all of this as evidence against yourself, as proof that something went wrong, that you went wrong, that your life took turns it shouldn't have taken, that you ended up somewhere you weren't supposed to be. And underneath all of that is this quiet suffering, this sense that if only things had been different, if only you had been smarter or luckier or stronger, you'd be somewhere else by now, somewhere better, somewhere that makes sense. But instead, you're here, looking back at a path that seems full of detours and dead ends and disasters, and wondering what it was all for, what any of it was for. And maybe there's this creeping fear that it wasn't for anything, that your struggles were just random suffering with no meaning, no purpose, no redemption, just pain that you had to endure because life is hard and that's how it goes sometimes. And if that's true, if there's no deeper pattern, no hidden design, then what does that make all those years of difficulty? What does that make you? But what if I told you something that might sound impossible right now? What if every single one of those struggles, every failure and loss and heartbreak and humiliation, what if they weren't mistakes at all? What if they weren't evidence that something went wrong, but evidence that something went exactly right? What if your life hasn't been falling apart, but falling into place? What if everything that hurt you was also preparing you? Not preparing you for some future redemption where it all finally makes sense in retrospect, but preparing you to be who you are right now, to know what you know, to see what you see, to have the depth and wisdom and capacity that only comes from having been through what you've been through. What if your struggles weren't obstacles that got in the way of your real life, but the very forge in which your real life was being shaped? What if you're not behind where you're supposed to be, but exactly where you need to be, having traveled exactly the path that was required to bring you here? And what if the fact that you can't see that yet, the fact that it still looks like a mess, that's just because you're too close to it? You're still inside the story. You can't see the whole shape yet. But what if the shape is perfect? What if everything that seemed broken was actually breaking you open? And what if who you are now, reading these words, listening to this voice, what if you're the person those struggles were creating all along? Let me sit with you in this for a while, because this isn't something you can understand quickly. This isn't a reframe you can just accept and move on. This goes to the core of how you've been interpreting your entire life. And that interpretation has to shift not through force, but through seeing, through looking at what happened to you from a completely different angle. So let's start with something simple. Let's start with the idea that nothing in nature is wasted. A seed doesn't go into the ground and immediately become a tree. It has to break apart first. The shell that protected it has to crack open. The structure that kept it safe has to be destroyed. And from the outside, if you could see what was happening to that seed beneath the soil, it would look like death. It would look like failure. The seed is disintegrating, but that disintegration is necessary. The seed has to stop being a seed before it can become a tree. And what looks like destruction is actually transformation. The old form has to dissolve so the new form can emerge, and you're like that. The struggles you've been through, they've been breaking you open. They've been dissolving the old form. They've been destroying who you thought you were so that who you actually are could emerge. And while you're in that process, while you're being broken down, it doesn't feel like preparation. It feels like annihilation. It feels like everything is going wrong. But that's only because you're identified with the seed. You think you are that old form and you're terrified of losing it. But you're not the seed. You're not the shell. You're what's inside. You're what's trying to grow. And the struggles aren't destroying you. They're destroying what was containing you. Think about a piece of metal being forged into a blade. You take raw iron, which is brittle and weak and impure, and you put it in fire. Extreme fire. Fire that would destroy almost anything else, and then you hammer it, you beat it repeatedly, forcing the impurities out, forcing the molecules to align, forcing the metal to become something it wasn't. And the metal, if it could feel, would experience this as torture, as violence, as something terrible being done to it. But what's actually happening is refinement. The fire and the hammer aren't destroying the metal, they're revealing what the metal can become. They're creating strength that wasn't there before. They're making something that can hold an edge, that can withstand impact, that can be useful for something that requires that particular strength. And you've been in the fire, you've been under the hammer, not because you're being punished, not because you did something wrong, but because what you're becoming requires that kind of refinement. The struggles weren't random cruelty. They were the specific heat and pressure needed to transform your particular metal into your particular blade. And you couldn't have become what you are without them. You couldn't have the strength you have, the wisdom you have, the compassion you have, the resilience you have, without having been broken down and rebuilt. That's how transformation works. Not through addition, but through subtraction. Not through getting more, but through losing what wasn't real to begin with. And here's what's hard to see when you're in the middle of it. The struggles don't feel like they're preparing you for anything. They just feel like suffering, like things going wrong, like bad luck or bad choices or bad timing. You don't wake up in the middle of heartbreak and think, oh, this is refining me. You don't lose everything you've built and think, this must be exactly what I need. You think it's a disaster. You think it's unfair. You think it shouldn't be happening. And that resistance, that sense that something is wrong, that makes the suffering worse. Because you're not just experiencing the difficulty, you're also fighting it. You're also carrying the story that this shouldn't be happening, that you don't deserve this, that it's ruining your life. And that story adds a whole other layer of pain on top of the actual experience. But what if you dropped that story? What if you stopped insisting that your struggles are evidence that something went wrong? What if you considered, just for a moment, that everything that happened to you was exactly what needed to happen? Not because some cosmic plan required your suffering, but because you're the person you are today because of what you went through. And who you are today is not an accident. It's not a consolation prize. It's what was being prepared the whole time. Let's get specific about this. Think about something hard you went through. Maybe a relationship that ended badly, maybe a job you lost, maybe a failure that felt devastating at the time. And notice how much of your suffering around that event is actually about the story you're telling about it. The story that it shouldn't have happened. The story that it proved something bad about you. The story that it set you back or ruined your chances or damaged you in some permanent way. Now, what if none of that is true? What if that thing that happened, as painful as it was, actually freed you from something that wasn't working? What if it showed you something about yourself or about others that you needed to see? What if it forced you to develop capacities you wouldn't have developed otherwise? What if it led you, in ways you can't quite trace, to where you are now? And where you are now, even if it's not where you thought you'd be, even if it's not where you wanted to be, what if it's exactly where you need to be? What if the person you are now, with all your scars and wisdom and hard-won understanding, what if that person couldn't exist without that struggle? What if you tried to skip it, tried to have an easier path, and you ended up somewhere that looked better but felt emptier because you hadn't developed the depth that only comes from going through hard things? This is what people miss when they look back at their lives with regret. They imagine some alternate version of themselves who didn't make the mistakes, who didn't experience the losses, who took the easier path, and they assume that version would be better off, happier, more successful, more fulfilled. But that's fantasy. That's not how it works. Because the person who didn't go through what you went through isn't you. There's someone else entirely. Someone with different knowledge, different capacities, different strengths, and different weaknesses. And you have no idea whether their life would actually be better. You're just imagining that it would be because you're in pain and you want the pain to have been avoidable. But what if it wasn't avoidable? What if you needed to go through exactly what you went through to become capable of whatever you're here to do? What if the struggles were curriculum, not punishment? What if they were training, not torture? What if every single hard thing you've been through was preparing you for something that required exactly that particular preparation? And I know this is hard to accept because it means you can't blame your past anymore. You can't use your struggles as an excuse for why you're not where you want to be. You can't hide behind your wounds and say, well, if I hadn't been through all that, I'd be different, I'd be better. Because actually, if you hadn't been through all that, you'd be weaker. You'd be more naive. You'd be less capable of handling complexity and difficulty. You'd be less compassionate because you wouldn't have suffered enough to understand suffering. You'd be less wise because you wouldn't have made enough mistakes to learn from them. You'd be less interesting because you wouldn't have depth. And depth only comes from having been to the depths, from having hit bottom and discovered you could survive it, from having lost everything and found out you're still here. That knowledge, that unshakable knowing that you can handle difficulty, that you can endure, that you can rebuild, that's not something you can get from reading about it or thinking about it. You can only get it from living through it. And you have lived through it. Every struggle you've survived has added to your capacity to survive more. Every loss you've metabolized has deepened your ability to hold loss without being destroyed by it. Every failure you've recovered from has proven that failure isn't fatal. You're building an internal resilience that no external circumstance can give you and no external circumstance can take away. And that resilience, that's preparation. That's armor. That's the foundation for everything that comes next. But there's another dimension to this that we need to explore. Your struggles didn't just prepare you by making you stronger or wiser or more capable. They prepared you by showing you what doesn't work, by eliminating paths that weren't yours, by stripping away identities that weren't real. Think about how much time you spent trying to be something you weren't, trying to fit into a role that didn't fit, trying to succeed at something that wasn't really yours. And you couldn't see that at the time. You thought that's what you wanted. You thought that's who you were supposed to be. But your struggles with it, your inability to make it work no matter how hard you tried, that was information. That was your system telling you, this isn't it, this isn't your path, stop forcing this. But you kept forcing it because you thought you were supposed to. Because everyone said this was the right thing. Because you'd invested so much already. Because you didn't want to admit defeat, and so the struggle intensified, the resistance got stronger. Until eventually something broke. You lost it, it ended, it fell apart, and you thought that was failure. But actually, that was mercy. That was life saving you from wasting more years on something that was never going to fulfill you. That was the universe, or fate, or whatever you want to call the intelligence that runs things, saying no, not this, something else. And you couldn't hear it gently, so it had to be said loudly. Through failure, through loss, through struggle, because that's the only language that gets through when we're stubbornly committed to the wrong thing. And this happens over and over in life. We commit to something that's not ours, and we struggle with it until we finally let it go. A relationship that's not right, but we keep trying to make it work until it implodes. A career that doesn't fit, but we keep pushing until we burn out or get fired, or just can't do it anymore. A version of ourselves that we're trying to maintain, but that keeps cracking under the pressure until we finally have to admit we're someone different. And every one of those endings, every one of those failures, as painful as they are, they're actually course corrections. They're redirections. They're your life trying to get you back on track, trying to align you with what's actually true for you instead of what you think should be true for you. And the struggle is the friction between those two things, between what you're trying to force and what's actually trying to emerge, between who you're trying to be and who you actually are. And eventually, the struggle gets so intense that you have to surrender. You have to let go. You have to admit that this isn't working and you need to try something else. And that surrender, that release, that's not defeat. That's wisdom. That's you finally listening to what's been trying to tell you all along. And once you surrender, once you stop fighting, something shifts. A new path appears. A new possibility opens. Not because you created it through effort, but because you stopped blocking it through resistance. You got out of your own way. You let life move you instead of trying to force life to go where you wanted it to go. This is the pattern. Struggle means resistance. Resistance means you're fighting against what is, and what is, whether you like it or not, is reality. You can fight reality, you can insist it should be different, but reality doesn't care. It just is. And when you fight it, you suffer. Not because reality is punishing you, but because fighting reality is inherently painful. It's exhausting, it's futile. You're using all your energy to push against something that isn't going to move. And eventually you wear yourself out and you have to stop. You have to give up the fight. And in that giving up, in that collapse, something new becomes possible. Because now you're working with what is instead of against it. Now you're flowing with reality instead of swimming upstream. And suddenly, things get easier. Not because circumstances changed, but because you changed your relationship to them. You stopped resisting. You stopped insisting that things be different. You accepted what is. And from that acceptance, a different kind of action becomes possible. Action that's aligned with reality instead of opposed to it. Action that flows instead of forces. Action that works because it's working with the grain of things instead of against it. And this is what your struggles have been teaching you. They've been teaching you where you're out of alignment, where you're forcing, where you're trying to make something work that isn't working. They've been showing you the gap between your ideas about how life should be and how life actually is. And that gap, that's where all your suffering lives, in the resistance, in the refusal to accept what is. But the struggles, by making that refusal so painful, they've been training you to let go, to surrender, to stop fighting, not to give up on life, but to give up on your ideas about how life should be, to release your grip on the outcome, to trust the process even when you can't see where it's going. That's what all the difficulty has been for, to exhaust your capacity to control, to break down your insistence that you know better than life does, to humble you into wisdom. Because wisdom isn't something you learn intellectually. It's something you're forced into through experience, through having your plans repeatedly destroyed until you stop making such rigid plans, through having your certainties repeatedly disproven until you stop being so certain, through having your control repeatedly wrested from you until you stop trying to control everything. That's the preparation. Not preparation to achieve something specific, but preparation to live. To actually live. To be present with what is instead of constantly wishing you were somewhere else. To engage with reality as it actually is instead of as you think it should be. To respond to what's here instead of reacting from what you wish were here. Now let's talk about what this means for how you see yourself. Because if your struggles were preparing you, then you're not a victim of your past. You're not damaged by what happened to you. You're shaped by it. You're defined by it in the best sense. You're the person you are because of everything you've been through, and that person is not broken. That person is capable. That person has depth. That person has earned wisdom that people who've had easier lives will never have. And that's not to romanticize suffering. It's not to say struggle is good or you should seek it out or you should be grateful for your pain. It's just to say that struggle is transformative. It changes you. And the change isn't damage, it's development. You're not who you were before the struggles. You're someone more, someone deeper, someone who knows things that can only be known through experience. And that knowing, that lived understanding, that's valuable. That's power. Not power over others, but power to be with what is. Power to handle difficulty. Power to remain steady when things fall apart. Power to start again when everything ends. Power to love even after heartbreak. Power to trust, even after betrayal. Power to hope even after despair. Those capacities, they're not given, they're earned, they're forged through struggle. And you have them now because you went through what you went through. And here's what that means practically. It means you can stop seeing yourself as someone who's been through too much, someone who's damaged goods, someone who carries too much baggage. Those are just stories, they're interpretations. They're one way of looking at your experience, but they're not the only way. Another way is to see yourself as someone who's been prepared, someone who's been through the fire and came out refined, someone who's been tested and proven, someone who has the scars to show they've actually lived instead of just existed. And when you shift to that way of seeing, everything changes. Your struggles stop being sources of shame and become sources of strength. Your wounds stop being things to hide and become evidence of battles you've survived. Your past stops being something you're running from and becomes something you're standing on. A foundation, a base of experience and wisdom that informs everything you do now. And from that foundation, from that ground of hard-won understanding, you can build something real. Something that won't collapse at the first difficulty because you've already been through difficulties and you know you can handle them. Something that's authentic because it's built from who you actually are, not who you wish you were. Something that matters because it comes from the depths of your experience, not the shallows of your fantasies. But I want to be clear about something. Saying your struggles prepared you doesn't mean they were easy or that you should be over them by now or that you're wrong for still carrying pain from them. The preparation doesn't erase the suffering. It doesn't make what happened okay. It doesn't mean you have to forgive people who hurt you or be grateful for experiences that were genuinely traumatic. All it means is that you're here now, and who you are now includes everything that happened to you. And you can either see that as a burden or you can see it as a foundation. Either way, it's real. It's part of you. But how you hold it, how you interpret it, that determines whether it weighs you down or lifts you up. And the interpretation that serves you isn't the one that makes you a victim. It's the one that makes you a survivor. Not just a survivor in the sense that you didn't die, but a survivor in the sense that you metabolized what happened. You integrated it. You turned it into wisdom and strength instead of letting it turn into bitterness and fragility. And that's work. That's a choice you make again and again. The choice to find meaning in what happened instead of just pain. The choice to use what you learned instead of just being defined by what you lost. The choice to let your struggles make you better instead of just bitter. And maybe this is the real preparation. Not preparation for some specific future event or achievement, but preparation to be someone who can be with life as it is. Someone who doesn't need everything to be perfect to be okay. Someone who can handle complexity and ambiguity and difficulty without falling apart. Someone who's developed the internal resources to navigate whatever comes. Because life is hard, it just is, and it doesn't get easier, it gets more complex, more demanding, more full of things you can't control and can't predict and can't prepare for. And if you haven't been through difficulty, if you haven't developed wisdom and the capacity to handle challenge, then you're going to be constantly overwhelmed. Constantly feeling like you can't cope, constantly looking for someone to rescue you or something to make it easier. But if you have been through difficulty, if you have been prepared through struggle, then you know you can handle hard things. You've proven it to yourself. You've done it before, and you can do it again. And that knowing changes everything. It makes you steady. It makes you reliable. It makes you someone who can be counted on when things get tough, because you don't panic. You don't collapse. You just deal with what's in front of you because you know how. Because you've been trained by your struggles to be someone who can handle struggle. Think about a tree that grows in a windy place. The constant wind pushes against it, bends it, forces it to develop deeper roots and a stronger trunk just to stay standing. And if you compared that tree to one that grew in a sheltered place with no wind, the sheltered tree might look prettier. It might grow taller, faster. But the wind-blown tree is stronger. It can withstand storms that would snap the sheltered tree in half. And when the big winds come, when the real test comes, the tree that's been prepared by constant small winds survives while the sheltered tree falls. You're the wind-blown tree. Your struggles have been the constant pressure that forced you to develop stronger roots, a more resilient structure, a capacity to bend without breaking. And yes, you might not look as pretty as people who've had easier lives. You might not have grown as tall as fast, but you're stronger. You're more capable. You're prepared for storms they can't even imagine. And when those storms come, and they will come for everyone eventually, you'll be ready. Not because you're special, but because you've been trained. Because life has been training you all along through every struggle you've faced, and now you're ready for whatever comes next. Not in the sense that you can control it or avoid difficulty, but in the sense that you can handle it. You've proven that to yourself again and again. And that proof, that lived experience of your own capacity, that's the real gift your struggles gave you. And here's something else. Your struggles prepared you to help others because you've been where they are. You've felt what they're feeling. You've struggled with what they're struggling with, and you came through. Not perfectly, not without scars, but you came through. And that means you can show others it's possible. You can be living proof that struggle isn't the end, that difficulty doesn't destroy you, that you can lose everything and rebuild, that you can be broken and heal, that you can fall and get back up. And that's valuable. That's needed. Because people who haven't been through hard things can offer advice, but they can't offer understanding. They can tell you what you should do, but they can't show you how to be with what you're going through. But you can, because you've been there, and your presence, your existence as someone who went through struggle and came out the other side, that's medicine for people who are still in it. That's hope for people who can't see a way forward. That's proof that it's possible. And you didn't plan to be that. You didn't go through difficulty so you could help others. You just went through it. But now that you're here, now that you have that experience, you can use it. You can let what you've been through inform how you show up for others, how you hold space for their pain, how you offer wisdom from experience instead of platitudes from ignorance. And that's part of the preparation too. You weren't just being prepared for your own life. You were being prepared to be useful in others' lives, to be someone who can offer something real, because you've lived something real. And that's a gift. Not the struggle itself, but what the struggle made possible. The depth, the wisdom, the compassion, the strength. Those are gifts. And they're yours now because of everything you've been through. So what do you do with all this? How do you live from this understanding that your struggles were preparing you? You stop resisting what's already happened. You stop wishing your past were different. You stop carrying your history as shame or damage or evidence that something's wrong with you. You start to see it as the exact curriculum you needed to become who you are. And from that seeing, you can begin to trust. Not trust that everything will work out the way you want, but trust that everything that happens is workable, is useful, is part of the preparation for what comes next. You start to see difficulty not as punishment, but as training, not as evidence that you're failing, but as evidence that you're growing. Because growth hurts. Change hurts. Transformation requires the destruction of the old form. And if you're going through struggle right now, if you're in the middle of something hard and you can't see how it could possibly be preparing you for anything, just know this. You can't see it yet because you're not ready to see it yet. You're still becoming. You're still being shaped. And the meaning will reveal itself, not when you figure it out intellectually, but when you become the person you couldn't have been without this experience. And one day, you'll look back and you'll see how everything connected, how every struggle was exactly what you needed when you needed it, how your path, as messy and painful as it was perfect. Not perfect in the sense that it was pleasant, but perfect in the sense that it was precisely what was required to turn you into you. And if you're hearing this, if these words are landing somewhere in you, if something is shifting in how you see your own story, I want to invite you to mark this moment, like this video. Not for me, but as a gesture to yourself that something changed here, that you're beginning to see your struggles differently, that you're ready to stop being a victim of your past and start being someone who was prepared by it. And if you want to continue exploring these ideas, if you want more reflections on how to make meaning from difficulty and how to live with more trust and less resistance, consider subscribing to this channel. This isn't about collecting followers. It's about creating a space for people who are ready to see their lives through a different lens, who are done feeling broken and ready to recognize their becoming. You're already here, which means you're already part of this. So thank you. Thank you for your willingness to look at your struggles with fresh eyes. Thank you for your courage to consider that maybe nothing went wrong. Thank you for being here. As we close, I want to leave you with one last thought. Everything you've been through, all the pain and loss and difficulty and heartbreak, it wasn't for nothing. It was for you. It was building you, shaping you, preparing you to be exactly who you are right now. And who you are right now is enough. Not enough in the sense that you shouldn't keep growing, but enough in the sense that you don't need to be fixed. You're not broken. You're forged. You're refined. You're someone who's been through the fire and came out tempered. And whatever comes next, whatever you're being prepared for now, you're ready. Because you've always been ready. Your struggles made sure of that. They gave you everything you need. Not everything you want, but everything you need. The strength, the wisdom, the resilience, the compassion, the depth. It's all there. Built into you through experience, through living, through struggling, through surviving. So stop apologizing for your past. Stop hiding your scars. Stop seeing yourself as less than because you've been through more than. You're not less. You're more. You're someone who knows, someone who's been tested, someone who's proven. And that's rare. That's valuable. That's beautiful in a way that easy lives can never be. So own it. Own your story, own your struggles, not with pride in the suffering, but with recognition of what the suffering created. You, this version of you, right here, right now, exactly as you are. That's what all the preparation was for. For this moment, for this awareness, for this recognition that you're not a victim of your journey. You're the result of it. And the result is someone who's ready for whatever comes next, someone who's been prepared not despite the struggles, but because of them. Welcome to who you've become. You earned every bit of it.